Hi, I'm Erika Anderson. I'm the curator of mineralogy and petrology at the Hunterian Museum at the University of Glasgow. So I'll be talking about bringing geoethics into the museum. So first off, geoethics, there we go, is the ethical and social and cultural implications of the geosciences. So that can be research, knowledge, practices, and communication. So the geology-based industries can have a pretty well-deserved bad reputation. And a lot of that is because of unethical behavior. So geoethics is about trying to bring that ethical frame of mind and interweaving it into training for geologists and so on. And professional geologists in some countries do have to take ethics exams. So it has been talked about for a while, but it is about just kind of moving it even further. And we can work with other disciplines as well. There's paleoethics. There is a chance to bring this into other kind of parts of science as well. And for the geoethics, they talk a lot about different applications, one of them being sustainability, considering what an impact the fossil fuels industry has had on climate change. That is no question. And also the extraction industry is very energy intensive. But there's also been talk about geoheritage and communication, and that's where museums fit really well into bringing geoethics into the museum. Now, a major part of the museum, of course, is the collections. So I'll be talking about applying geoethics within the museum, as well as sort of the public engagement that a museum does. So of course, collection management, I would say as museums, we have been doing very well in terms of ethical work. But some of these could use just a bit more improvement, especially on the geoscience side. So I'll be explaining a couple of these further. The first one being the mineral market. So the mineral acquisitions is a little different than other natural history collections. So you can have donations from scientists, donations from amateurs, collections by staff. But for minerals specifically, a large portion are available on the mineral market, which is rather opaque. It happens behind closed doors, sometimes in cash without receipts. And it's assumed at the point of purchase that these minerals were obtained legally, that they're permits in import, export. And I can see that changing in the next 10 years or so, that we should be requiring copies of these permits, a bit more of the due diligence that we see in other collections like art or biology with CITES permits. We should be seeing that with minerals as well. So it's about setting those standards, and it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take a while to get the people who sell minerals on board with kind of changing the way they do things. So it will be about setting those standards. And I think another standard that would be very nice to have is the name of collectors and dates of collection, because when you buy a mineral, that extra data can be stripped from the specimen because these specimens have changed hands between the miners and middlemen, then to the dealers. And compared to other natural history collections, those names of those collectors or even the middle dealers are not kept. And I think that's an important part of the story and the history of specimens, is knowing these things. And we can't do that as easily when we don't have that information. And so a lot of people do not get credited for the work of finding the mineral or mining it. So we do want to set those standards. Another thing is destructive sampling. So I have gone further into this a few years ago in a spinach talk, but destructive sampling is a significant part of geoscience analysis. And it's about weighing the needs of the now and the needs of the future. We want to preserve specimens so they can be used in the future, but we also don't want to stop science from happening now. So no destructive sampling request should be an automatic yes or an automatic no. They should be considered. I do like the 1%, 10% guideline, which is 1% sampled at a time, 10% over a curator's lifetime, but that will, it's a guideline. You'll find some specimens you can give up more, some specimens even less, like meteorites. And it's really helpful to use the categories of specimens laid out by Price and Fitzgerald in 1996, as they've categorized the specimens for 1 to 5 by value, whether that's scientific value, like type specimens, or monetary value. And it can be useful in order to set up, who can approve a sample request, who can recommend. And then, of course, what comes into destructive sampling is how easy it is to sample it. How destructive will a destructive sample be? And an important part also is making that data accessible. And it can be very difficult to get the data back from scientists who are sampling, just because it's forgotten, you've moved on, it's not something that's immediate. So it's really helpful to use sort of automatic notifications in some databases to prod, to get some of that data back, and then making that data accessible, whether that's online through our digital databases, as well as getting back things like thin section mounts and microprobe mounts, so they can be used again instead of destructively sampling all over again. So again, it's about bringing the stuff that is ethical towards our collections, and working with our collections, getting the most use out of them, and working with the scientists as well. And of course, research further to that. Research ethics have been discussed and promoted for a long time. So of course, that ethical work is being done within museums, but also with the researchers that are coming to work with museum specimens. What's interesting is that for a lot of geoscientists, they don't use museum specimens the same way that other disciplines do. And it's something that should be promoted more. One, to be more sustainable. You don't need to go out and take a helicopter to the Arctic if that specimen already exists in an institution. And also, geosciences can be a little bit of a parachute science in the past, in that scientists will go out to a community, will take specimens and leave and do a lot of the analyses. And that work is trying to be more reciprocal, working more with local communities, sharing the knowledge, and being more respectful, which still has further to go, but has been recognized as something that needs to be worked on. And of course, I think it needs to be said, research is not neutral. A lot of geoscience research has been romanticized as, adventurous, going out to collect, finding out more about the world. But it's not always been neutral. A lot of that exploration was to find more resources to extract. A lot of research is funded because we do need to extract more material. So that research doesn't have its own biases in its way. Now, of course, if you want to be ethical, I do think equity, diversity, and inclusion is part of that. And that includes sort of the inequities that occur throughout an institution like a museum, and the colonialism that is a part of that. Many of our collections come from colonial times, come from sort of colonial extraction. And it's not just about hiring practices and making sure that your staff is diverse and that you're including them, but also that you are doing exhibits and events that include these equity, diversity, inclusion initiatives, which further to that, we'll move on to science communication. So that's more of what is happening, how the museum is engaging with the public. And we want that to happen ethically, of course. You want it to be factual. You want it to be accessible to your audiences. You'll have different audiences. Sometimes you might be doing an event with children. Your message will be a bit different than a lecture to other academics. And this communication occurs through a lot of different ways, through exhibits, outreach, social media, and teaching. And for teaching, we are a university museum, so we do have the opportunity to help teach courses with different departments. And this is an opportunity to have an impact on the future, CEOs of mining companies. This is the next generation of geoscientists. So we can talk about sort of impacts and untold stories based on objects that we're using. I recently gave a lecture on geoethics to a sustainable mining course that I was helping to teach. And it was about explaining the impacts of mining that had on different communities, some toxic environmental problems, climate change, destruction of geoheritage, and all of this can be told in a way to understand that, yes, we're geologists, we need mining, we will be working in the mining sector, but how can we start off by being ethical instead of dealing with the impacts afterwards? And of course, a museum has exhibits, and it is an important part of science communication. And of course, mining is so important, and museums are a way to explain. And I've seen a lot of exhibits on the blown up smartphone showing all the elements that are needed to get a smartphone to work. And it's important for the public to understand that, society does, it's integral to have these elements and we get them from the ground. But that doesn't mean that there isn't impacts that we need to be working on, such as, coal mining had such an impact on climate change, and that disproportionately affects members of the global south. And, exploration was about finding resources to extract. So there's a lot that can be told around these stories. And here I just have a photo of one of our exhibits, which has a display on Emily Dix, who is a paleobotanist, early woman in science. She worked on fossil plants in coal seams. And we have something called the curating discomfort, which was an intervention led by the curator of discomfort, Xandra Yemen, who worked with members of the community curators, to add perspectives and intervene and add labels and add objects to our exhibit. And this one had an extra label added that had the explanation that the fossils and her work was funded by coal, the coal industry, because those fossils had impacts on stratigraphy, which would help coal mining. And so though Emily Dix probably at the time did not know, about the impacts of coal and the fossil fuels and climate change, working the geosciences does have that impact, and, it's not always apparent. And here we have just some outreach activities. So a lot of museums in both their venues and other venues will do outreach activities to explain science. So whether that's using museum objects or talking about a scientific fact, it can be used really well. And to use that experiential learning with objects is great. But it's also an opportunity, depending on your audience, to explain things. I will be doing a minerals and makeup outreach event soon, and I'll be talking about mica. Mica is glitter in makeup, and it can be really beautiful and shimmery, but also it has an issue where a lot of companies are trying to clean up their supply lines because child labor is a huge issue in the mines. So, if I'm talking to adults, that is something that I can tell that people probably don't know about. I've also talked about coal recently in an outreach tour where I talked about, the science of coal, the impacts of climate change, the use of jet in jewelry, especially in the Victorian era, women in science, talked about Emily Dix, and also about how a lot of our collection of coal comes from a professor at the University of Glasgow, and Gregory, who was very racist, and we do have to deal with the impacts and legacy of that on our collections. So again, it's a great opportunity to talk about all these things and just explain what happens in the geosciences and sort of the ethics that go into them. And social media, it's outreach that is digital and has become such an integral part of communication for museums. And so whether there's institutional accounts or staff accounts, it's an opportunity to reach out to people who might not make it to a museum physically, or maybe they can't afford to come, or they live across the globe. But it's a time that you can point out some things about museum objects. Like this one I was talking about, this coal was probably used to train geoscientists who went and then mined it and then, didn't know that climate change would be such an issue, and can be just a really way to do further science communication. Again, I'm talking about colonialism with this vial of glitter dust. Well, it's not really glitter, but it's some rock dust that did look glittery. And again, it shows just that you can bring it up. And so in conclusion, geoethics can be brought up in a couple of different ways. So within the museum through ethical work that we always strive to do, but as well as kind of bringing geoethics out to the public and explaining the impacts of the geosciences, good and bad, and geoethics to the public. So thank you for doing this, and I look forward to your questions.